Since embracing both Claude Code and agentic AI, I've become more productive than ever. However, whilst this increase in productivity is ultimately a good thing, it has brought about a number of other issues, specifically when it comes to application deployment. This is because I've still been using my pre-AI workflow of deploying to a VPS instance using Docker Stack. And whilst it works for more simple setups, when it comes to working with multiple SaaS products and agentic AI, I'm not only starting to feel these constraints, but I'm also starting to miss many of the features that comes with other platforms, such as Vercel, Netlify, or Railway.com. The one feature that I'm missing the most, however, is review apps, also known as preview deployments. This is where whenever you create a pull request in your Git repository, then a version of that code is both built and deployed for you to review the changes on. This not only makes it incredibly useful to see what the merged-in changes will look like, but in the age of agentic AI, it's perhaps now more valuable than it ever was before. In addition to missing this feature, however, the fact that I was now managing multiple applications on a single VPS instance was starting to become a little tedious, and so I decided to effectively break up with my current setup and move on to something else. However, rather than texting my ex and getting back with the old flame that is Vercel, I instead decided to see what other options were out there. In my research, I came across 3 different open source platforms: Coolify, Doku, and Dokploy, each of which had their own unique flavor when it came to deploying applications on a VPS. And so I decided to do a quick speed dating round with each of these 3 options, in order to see if there was one, if any, I had chemistry with. As it turns out, whilst 2 of these ended up being somewhat underwhelming, there was one I not only felt sparks with, but it was pretty much love at first sight: Dokploy, which has quickly become one of my favorite ways to deploy to a VPS. The reason it was pretty much love at first sight is because I believe that Dokploy has one of the best user interfaces of any platform as a service that I've ever used. In fact, I would go even as far as saying that it gives Vercel a run for its money. However, unlike Vercel, you can both self-host Dokploy and use it to deploy applications on your own VPS instances. Despite being self-hostable, Dokploy certainly doesn't skimp out, and comes with many features that you would typically expect to find on these more dedicated platforms, such as automated deployments whenever you push code to GitHub, application and server monitoring, security features including automatic HTTPS and secrets management, and of course, review apps. Not only this, but all of this comes for free. All you have to do is BYOV, which is bring your own VPS. Personally, I find that Dokploy ticks so many of the boxes when it comes to deploying onto a VPS that I'm actually going to go ahead and move all of my production services to it, which is going to be incredibly easy to do so, as Dokploy also supports Docker Compose files. However, rather than just talking about it, I thought I'd do a video showing how I like to set it up, as well as showing how easy it is to deploy a full project using Dokploy. Therefore, in order to do so, we first need a project. Given that this is a modern and revamped approach to deploying onto a VPS in what I would consider a production-ready way, I decided to also revamp my original guestbook web app, which I built for my original production-ready VPS video. This time, however, rather than it being built using Go, I instead decided to build it using Next.js, and added in a number of new features, such as authentication, which is using the fantastic BetterAuth package, usernames so you can see who wrote the message, the ability to reply to messages, and also to hide messages from certain users as well. And yes, most of these features have been added because a select few people just can't behave themselves when given free rein online. Shame on you. In any case, in order to deploy both this brand new version of the Guestbook web app and to also deploy our own instance of Dokploy, we're going to need a VPS instance to deploy it on. Fortunately, that's where the sponsor of today's video comes in, Hostinger, who have once again given us a fantastic offer for a long-term VPS. Not only is Hostinger incredibly affordable, but just like Dokploy, they don't skimp out on the features. Take, for example, the KVM2, which is the VPS instance that I decided to buy both for running Dokploy and my own production services. The KVM2 comes with a cool 2 vCPUs and a massive 8GB of RAM, which is more than enough for running multiple applications, or in my case, multiple review apps at once. Whilst with other providers, 8 gigs can cost you an arm and a leg, when it comes to Hostinger, it comes in at the incredible price of of only $6.99 a month when you purchase a 24-month term, which, of course, I did, as I fully intend to migrate over and run these services for at least a couple of years. If that price wasn't good enough, however, you can actually get some additional savings by using my coupon code Dreams of Code when you reach the checkout. This not only helps my channel to grow, but it would also give you an additional 10% off the already low price. It's basically a win-win-win. So in order to get your own VPS and to take control of your own infrastructure, then head on over to Hostinger using my link in the description down below, and make sure to use the coupon code Dreams of Code for that additional 10% off. A big thank you to Hostinger for sponsoring this video. In any case, with a VPS instance now acquired, whether it's using Hostinger or someone else, the next thing to do is to do some preliminary setup. The first thing that you're going to want to do in order to have Dokploy deployed is to make sure that you're running an LTS version of Ubuntu on your machine, with the most recent one being Ubuntu 24.04 at the time of recording. However, if you have a VPS instance provided by Hostinger, you can actually go ahead and select a base operating system image that already has Dokploy installed, meaning that you don't even have to SSH in order to set it up. In my case, however, I'm going to go ahead and choose the LTS version, just so that I can go ahead and show how to install Dokploy from scratch. With the base operating system selected, the next thing to do when it comes to Hostinger is to make sure to go ahead and set up SSH, making sure you have a strong password for your root user, as well as adding in any SSH keys. Once that's complete, as per your provider, the next thing to do is wait for your instance to be deployed, and then go ahead and SSH in. In my case, I'm actually going to go ahead and install Tailscale first before installing Dokploy. This is something that I've now been doing when it comes to all of my VPS instances, in order to both protect SSH as well as any other services running on the machine. It basically provides an extra layer of security, which does also come in handy when setting up Dokploy in a minute, which I'll talk more about. If you want to install Tailscale yourself on your own machines, you can do so for free, and I have another video that goes into this in more detail, which I worked with the team at Tailscale on. In any case, with Tailscale now deployed, I went and set up my firewall to make sure that I can only SSH in through my Tailnet, then set up the magic DNS on the Tailscale dashboard to set the hostname of this machine to Zen VPS. With that all done, it's now time to go ahead and install Dokploy. To do so is incredibly simple. All we need to do is head on over to the Dokploy website at dokploy.com. Here you can see that the website itself provides a simple CLI command that we can use for installation, which is something I really appreciate when it comes to setting up a new system. Before we go ahead and do that, however, one thing I should mention is that Dokploy also provides its own managed instance of Dokploy Cloud. So if you don't want to use your own dedicated VPS in order to host Dokploy, then you can go ahead and make use of their managed service, which is also a great way to support the project. Additionally, one interesting thing to note is that if we scroll down to the bottom here, you can see that Dokploy has a number of sponsors, one of which happens to be the sponsor of this video, Hostinger, which is actually a coincidence. I guess they just have good taste. Okay, that's enough humble bragging. Let's go ahead and actually copy this command and paste it into our VPS. To do so, all we have to do is go ahead and click this copy button. Then if I head on over to my VPS instance, paste it in, we should see Dokploy be installed. This install task can take a few minutes to go through. However, through the power of movie magic, I'm going to make it take a few seconds. Once it's complete, you should receive the following message, letting you know that congratulations, Dokploy has been installed, and the server is available on the public IP address at port 3000. If I head on over to this URL, you can see it takes us to an initial setup page for Dokploy, where we can set up our admin accounts with both email and password credentials. However, one thing to be aware of is this site is currently running through HTTP, not HTTPS, which means that these credentials will be transmitted as plain text. Therefore, if you set up Tailscale on your VPS like I did, then I would recommend instead using the Tailscale IP address of your instance, as this will encrypt the data being sent to the server. However, if you don't have Tailscale set up, then don't worry. Instead, make sure to use a memorable but throwaway password, which you should change as soon as we've set up HTTPS, which is what we're going to do next. In order to set up HTTPS, we're going to need to set up a domain name. And whilst I've been on a bit of a spending spree recently, in my opinion, you can never have too many. And so for this project, I decided to buy yet another domain earlier before filming this video. However, as I mentioned, because I've been on a bit of a spending spree, then I didn't have too much disposable cash. Fortunately, Hostinger provide a number of top-level domains for only 99 cents. So I went and purchased the zenvps.xyz domain, which I was kind of surprised that I didn't have already. In any case, with my brand new domain name acquired, all for just 99 cents for the first year, it was time to configure it. To do so, all I need to do is go ahead and create an A record for the apex of the domain, pointing it to the IP address of the new VPS instance. After doing so, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and get a refreshing drink, as DNS propagation can take anywhere between a couple of minutes to a few hours. In order to check whether or not the DNS record has propagated to your local DNS server, you can use the following nslookup command, passing in your domain name. Once it comes back with the IP address that you've assigned, then you know you're good to go. In my case, this didn't take too long, but again, that's thanks to the power of movie magic. In any case, with our domain name now set up and pointing to our VPS instance, we're now ready to go ahead and secure our Dokploy instance with HTTPS. In order to do so, we just need to head down to the web server settings inside of the sidebar, where we can go ahead and add in our new domain into the following field. In my case, it's going to be zenvps.xyz. With the domain name defined, the next thing to do is to go ahead and enter an email address for Let's Encrypt. This will basically be used to let you know when your certificate is about to expire. In my case, I'm just going to go ahead and set this to be admin.zenvps.xyz. With that defined, we can now go ahead and turn on HTTPS before then selecting a certificate provider, which in this case is going to be Let's Encrypt. Okay, now we can go ahead and save this, and the domain should be assigned. Then after about 30 seconds or so, we should be able to access our site using HTTPS with the domain name that we provided, which if I now go ahead and test using HTTPS zenvps.xyz, you can see I'm now on my site, and not only that, but we're secured and encrypted. With HTTPS enabled, we can now authenticate and make changes to our Dokploy instance securely. If you didn't originally use Tailscale to set up, I would now recommend changing your password to something else, which you can do on the profile page of Dokploy. With that, we're now ready to begin deploying the services for the Guestbook web app. To do so, let's first head on over to the Projects tab and create a new project, which in my case, I'm going to name Guestbook. Personally, I really like that Dokploy allows you to group services by project, as this to me feels rather intuitive, especially as it's very rare for me to have a production project that is only a single service. Speaking of which, the Guestbook v2 project is no different, as it requires an instance of Postgres in order for it to store its data. Typically, when it comes to production services, I like to use Neon for all of my Postgres needs, as they provide a number of features that I personally find quite valuable. However, when it comes to the Guestbook web app v2, I don't need any of these features. And given that Hostinger provides 100 gigabytes of storage on the KVM2 instance, then it just makes sense to go ahead and deploy an instance of Postgres here. Fortunately, Dokploy makes it not only incredibly easy to do so, but it also provides a number of features that make Postgres production ready, including the ability to back up your data to an S3 compatible store. So for this video, let's go ahead and deploy an instance of Postgres using Dokploy. In order to create a database instance using Dokploy, we can use the Create Service button, which will give us a number of different options to choose from. For the moment, let's go ahead and choose Database, which will then present us with yet another modal dialog. Here you can see that Dokploy provides a number of different database options for us to choose from, including MongoDB, MySQL, and Redis. In my case, I'm going to go with Postgres. Next, we then need to configure this Postgres instance, first by giving it a name, followed by selecting the server we want it to be deployed on. This is probably one of the two UI decisions that I really dislike when it comes to Dokploy, as in our case, because we don't have any remote servers set up, then the correct option to select here is no option at all, which means it will then be deployed on the same instance where Dokploy is running. However, in my opinion, I don't think the UI explains this very well. In any case, that's just me nitpicking. Let's go ahead and finish our configuration, setting up the database name, the username, and the database password, which I'm going to set to password in this instance. Additionally, we can also go ahead and change the Docker image if we want to run a different Postgres version or run one with some certain extensions added. For this case, however, the default image will be fine. With the database configuration defined, let's go ahead and create it. It's worth mentioning that creating the service won't cause it to automatically deploy, and requires us to press the deploy button in order for that to happen. However, upon doing so, you can see it takes takes no time at all. Once that's done, we should then have our database up and running, which we can go ahead and check the logs for. As you can see, it's running perfectly, and we're ready to begin deploying the actual guestbook web app. In order to do so, if we head back on over to our guestbook project, we can then create a new service. This time, we can create an application instead of a database or any of the other three. One thing to mention, if you're already using Docker Compose, then here you can just go ahead and create a Compose service, which will allow you to either configure it with GitHub, or you can just copy and paste your compose.yaml in. If we go ahead and create the application, let's give it a name. I'm going to call this web because this is the guestbook web. And again, we're not going to select a server for this because we want to go ahead and deploy on the same VPS instance where Dokploy is running. In any case, upon clicking create, our new web service is now available and we can begin configuring it. The first thing we need to configure is to allow Dokploy to gain access to our actual code. In order to achieve this, we have a number of different options that Dokploy supports, including GitLab, Git, Docker registries, or just raw dog uploading the source code to it. In my case, the source code is available on GitHub, so I'm going to go ahead and configure the GitHub provider to have access to it. In order to do so, let's go ahead and use the following link to head on over to the Git settings, where we can connect our Git provider, which in my case is GitHub. Next, because the guestbook v2 code is inside of a GitHub organization, then I need to go ahead and enable this toggle and provide the organization's name, which in this case is dreamsofcode-io. If you're not using a GitHub org for your own code, then you can leave this disabled. Once configured, the next thing to do is to click the Create GitHub App button, which will then prompt us to authenticate with GitHub. Next, we can then go ahead and give this GitHub application a name, which I'm going to set to Dokploy-dreamsofcode-zenvps. Once created, we'll then be taken to our Dokploy instance, where we need to do one last thing in order to connect to GitHub. This is the only other bit of UI design that I really don't like, as it's not very obvious that there's something we still need to do in order to connect GitHub, which is to press this small install icon. On this next screen, we can then either allow access to all of the repositories in our organization or limit these to those selected. Because I'm a fan of Zero Trust, then I'm going to go ahead and grant access to the guestbook web app only. Now all that remains is to click the Install and Authorize button, and GitHub should now be connected, which I can confirm by heading back to the service page, which will now allow me to select from a GitHub repository. Therefore, let's go ahead and set this up, selecting the guestbook v2 repository and the main branch. As for the rest of the options, I'm going to leave these as is, which will automatically enable redeployments whenever we push up a change to the main branch. Next, we can then define how we want our code to be built. One thing to note is that building on the same machine that our application will be deployed on isn't exactly a best practice, as it can impact the performance of your production services. The Dokploy documentation gives some examples on how to better mitigate this, using a CI/CD pipeline, which I'll likely take a look at in another video. For this one, however, I'm going to show you how to build on the box itself. To do so, we have a number of different build options we can choose from, such as Dockerfile, Railpack, Nixpacks, and a few others as well. In the case of the guestbook web app v2, I've set this up to work with the three options that I mentioned, through adding in both a Dockerfile and a nixpacks.toml. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and leave the builder as Nixpacks, as I found it has the best performance and the easiest configuration. Additionally, whilst we're looking at the guestbook repo, one thing to note is that I've also modified the npm start command, so that it will automatically perform database migrations using Drizzle when the application starts up. So just something to keep in mind if you decide to use this repo as an inspiration for your own project. In any case, with our chosen build type selected, we're almost ready to deploy. However, before we can do so successfully, we need to go ahead and set up a few required environment variables, of which we can do on the Environment tab. For this project, there are 4 envars we need to set up. The first being the database URL, which is used for connecting to the database. The second is the betterauth secret, which is used for encrypting the betterauth session. The third is the resend API key, which is what I'm using for sending emails. And the last is the resend from email, which is the address that these emails will come from. So let's go about adding these in. For the database URL, we can obtain this from our database service by heading back on over to it and copying the internal URL, which we can then go ahead and paste in. Next, for the betterauth token, you can actually generate this yourself in the betterauth docs by clicking the following button and copying it over. As for the Resend API token, you can get this for free at resend.com, and both this token and the from email address are going to be specific to your own configuration. With that, the environment variables are now set up. However, one thing to mention is that these will be available both at runtime and build time, which is needed for Next.js. However, if you're using the Docker file builder, then you'll need to go ahead and define any build time envars specifically, which is done using the following text input, which is only available when you choose Docker file. With the environment variables set up, we can now go about deploying our application, which, similar to the database, is done by pressing the deploy button. We can check the build logs of this deployment if we want to by clicking the view button, which will let us know how it's getting on. However, because I know that this application is going to build, because I tested it earlier, instead I'm going to move on to the next task, which is to set up a domain name in order to access this web service on. We can achieve this through the Domains tab, where there's a button to add a new domain. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and set this to guestbook.zenvps.xyz. Additionally, I'm also going to go ahead and enable HTTPS and select the Let's Encrypt certificate provider. Once that's added, I'll also need to go ahead and make sure I have an A record set up pointing to this VPS's IP, which in my case I can do through the Hostinger dashboard, as this is where I purchased this domain. Once I've gone and added this record, I can then check to see if it's working by clicking the Validate DNS button, which in my case shows it as valid. This can sometimes take a couple of hours, so don't be discouraged if it's not working for you right away. With that, we now have a DNS record assigned to our deployment, and once it's finished building and deploying, we should then be able to access our service through it, which you can see is now working. And I can go ahead and create an account if I want to. Let's go ahead and set an email, and I should receive a 6-digit code in order to sign in. And with that, I'm now signed in and able to access my Guestbook VPS. And I can go ahead and leave a nice message of hello world live performance. With that, we've managed to get our deployment working, but in addition to this, we also have support for automatic deployments whenever we push up a change. For example, if I go ahead and change this to be, say, ZenBook rather than Zenful Guestbook, followed by going to add this change, so we go ahead and add navigation, git commit sure, change the title. Now if we go ahead and push this up, then if I head back on over to the Dokploy dashboard, we can see the automatic deployment is taking place. After a few seconds, if I head back on over to the Guestbook web app, we can see that the ZenBook title change has now been deployed. Whilst this is very cool, it is similar to what I had set up with Docker Stack, although I do believe Dokploy does it better. However, one feature that I didn't have in my existing setup was preview deployments, which is the one feature that I think is most important when it comes to working with agentic AI. To configure this with Dokploy is again incredibly simple. To do so, head on over to the Preview Deployment tab and click Configure. Then inside of this modal, we first need to specify a wildcard domain, which is what we'll use to access the review apps. In my case, I'm going to go ahead and set this to be *.zenvps.xyz. Again, you'll need to make sure that this wildcard domain has an A record pointing at your server. Once configured, the next thing to do is to enable HTTPS and to add in any environment variables, which I'm just going to go ahead and paste from my previous configuration. Lastly, you can then configure the number of preview deployments that you want running at a single time. Because we got plenty of memory thanks to Hostinger, I'm going to go ahead and set this to be 5. Okay, with that, let's go ahead and save our configuration before we then enable it, and our review apps should now be ready to go. To test that this is the case, I've gone ahead and asked ChatGPT Codex to add a new feature. This feature is to add a highlight effect to any messages that come from my username, so that people reading the message board can easily recognize messages that come from me. So let's go ahead and actually create this PR and see what it came up with. I also asked for 2 different versions because sometimes it can never get it right the first time. In any case, this should now go ahead and create a PR, which should then kick off the deployment app on our service, which if I go ahead and take a look at, we'll see if that is the case. As you can see, Dokploy has left a comment on the PR with the current status of the review app deployment, which in this case is building. We can verify that this is the case inside of our dashboard, where we can view the build logs. Once the build is complete, however, Dokploy will update this comment with a link to the preview deployment, which if I go ahead and click, we can see it's definitely very gaudy. ChatGPT Codex has done a job, may not be the best job, but it has increased the visibility of the messages from my username. With that, so we've managed to not only have our application be deployed to Dokploy, but we've also managed to get review apps or deploy apps being deployed as well, which will allow us to review the changes that any agentic AI makes before potentially approving them. In this case, I may offer a change request to the AI to tone it down a little. Agentic AI issues aside, as I mentioned, Dokploy has quickly become my favorite deployment platform to use with a VPS, and I'm looking forward to moving my production services over to it through the next couple of weeks. Until then, however, I want to give a big thank you to Hostinger, both for sponsoring today's video, but also for supporting other community projects such as Dokploy, and for making it much easier for software developers to be able to self-host, rather than having to rely on other platforms. If you want to get your own VPS instance to use with Dokploy, then Hostinger is both a great and affordable option for long-term VPS instances. So feel free to check them out using the link in the description down below, and make sure to use my coupon code DREAMSOFCODE for that additional discount. Otherwise, I want to give a big thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.